And there's a 20-minute slot, so one thing I want to kick off with is just to say fundamentally there's two ways of harnessing the sun's energy. You can use it to heat water, solar thermal, or you can use it to generate electricity, photovoltaics. And I'm going to focus my entire presentation just on photovoltaics this afternoon. And because photovoltaics ends up being a bit of a mouthful, I'm going to use the word PV for the rest of this presentation. And I have 10 points I'd like to make. First one is there's a lot of energy out there. Depending on who you ask, there's enough energy falling every hour on the planet from the sun to cover all our energy requirements at current levels of consumption. Put a different way, it's a piece of work done by a gentleman called Matthias Loster of University of California in Berkeley. He's drawn this little map showing solar irradiance. And on that map, there are a few dots which are centered on the deserts of the world. And if that amount of desert was covered with actually quite low efficiency PV cells, that would cover all our energy needs as a planet at current levels of consumption. So the challenge is not that there isn't enough stuff out there, the challenge is harnessing that effectively and efficiently. The other thing worth looking at this chart is if you look at the scale at the bottom, that shows solar irradiance, and it varies less than most people think. In particular, it varies less than our government thinks. And I would like just to leave you with this idea that if you install a PV system in Madrid, where it's got a notional 1 kilowatt system, in a year you would get about 1,300 kilowatt hours out of that system. Put that on a lorry, bring it to London, put it in London, you get about 900 kilowatt hours. So there's about a 30% drop between Madrid and London. Whereas I think there's a popular view, which is that surely solar goes gangbusters in Madrid and doesn't work in London at all. It's simply not the truth. Second point that applies to all renewables is, in terms of buildings or in any other area, we have to work out ways of saving energy first and then use renewables. And just to illustrate that point, I have a chart about the journey to the zero carbon home. Our government has said all homes zero carbon 2016, and this little chart here shows the steps. First one is the current average UK house. Second is the building regs. The third is a higher grade regulated by the AECB called silver. The next one is gold, and then the next one after that is AECB gold with just a kilowatt of PV, which is a relatively small installation. And then finally, at the very end, is AECB gold with 1.5 kilowatts of PV. The main message, whether it's PV or any other renewable, is that the road to the zero carbon home is going to be made up more by energy savings, even from current building standards, than by the application of renewables. And that's the correct order in which to do things. Third point, and this has been mentioned by the other speakers already, but is relevant to PV, is that electrical demand is actually going to be an increasing part of our home energy consumption. And I would use a slide here, a piece of work done by Element Energy for the LDA, the London Development Authority, that just contrasts a pre-1919 large home with a current building regs large home. And you'll see, as you might expect, that there's a big drop in terms of the carbon footprint between the two homes. The main difference is that the older houses, the carbon footprint is dominated by space heating. On the Part L large house on your right, you'll see that the space heating has become a much smaller element. Those of you familiar with the architect Le Corbusier, he coined the phrase about a home being a machine for living in. And a zero carbon home will feel a lot more like a well-engineered machine than it does something made of bricks and tiles and wood. So, as one of the other speakers already mentioned, the need for electrical power simply isn't going to go away. and that if anything, as a proportion of the energy used by a home is going to increase, and it makes sense to, where possible, to generate that locally. So my next point is that the mere act of microgeneration has its own effect on saving energy. One effect is you reduce the losses, and there is certainly a fair amount of electricity that leaks out between some remote generation plant and your home. But secondly, and as the previous speaker mentioned, if you start raising awareness, and in this case by having a display in the home showing how much energy is being used within the home and how much is being generated, perhaps in this case by a PV system, that in itself has a demonstrable reduction in energy consumption. The effect, incorporating, if you like, the effect of human behavioural change. From our studies, that's in the area of 10 to 20%. So you get that for nothing off the price of a display. All well and good. What about the cost? I'd like to leave you with the idea that when considering the cost, it's very easy to get trapped in some, in my mind, not very constructive discussion about payback. How quickly does this payback compare with buying grid electricity? And I think that's kind of missing the point. We are doing this because we want to reduce carbon, and therefore we should be looking at judging various technologies by how much does it cost, finite resource, to reduce a certain amount of carbon. And whatever way, when one is assessing a particular project with different types of technology, that's the way one should be looking at it. And just by way of example, I put together one specific study that was done to assess various different technologies for a particular project. The gentleman before me may be pleased to see that wind actually came out cheaper than PV. But there's some wild variations. The 2 points I'd like to make from this slide is that there are some wild variations between how much it costs per kilo of carbon. And secondly, if you look at the leftmost bars, the two left bars are in effect a large and then a small ground source heat pump. The two next bars are a large and then a small biomass system. And the point that I'd like to make is that sometimes you get some wild differences in the cost of carbon saved depending on the scale of the technology. So some renewables are excellent for large scale, others work well when you need to have that benefit of scalability. And on that point, my next point is just to say that PV as a technology, particularly the way it's currently constructed, is inherently a very scalable technology. Essentially it's made by getting ingots of silicon, so large, cutting it into thin slices and making photovoltaic cells out of the thin slices. And the permutations of what you do with this is almost infinitely variable. So just by way of example, on the left is the largest PV facade in Europe, second largest in the world. That's up in Manchester. And on the right, you can just about see on the roof a typical roof tile-based 2 kilowatt PV installation. And you can do pretty much everything from there down to a portable calculator. Next point, one of the games of this conference was to look about adding value to property, and my next point is just to say PV does add value to buildings. I would argue that probably most micro-generation systems would add value to buildings. If you're going to be able to get free electricity for 20 or 30 years, you would expect that would do something to the value of the building. A particular example is these two homes here, are part of a development in the East Midlands. The home on the left sold for 9% more than the home on the right. In fact, it was a small development of 20 houses, 10 had PV on and 10 didn't. And not only were the 10 with PV sold at a higher price to reflect the cost of the PV, every single house that had PV in it sold before one single house without the PV sold. And a lot of people say to me, so that was in Islington, was it, where the houses were £2 million? The answer is no, this was in the East Midlands, and these are relatively modest British homes. Next point is that PV as a technology is fundamentally very low, if not zero maintenance. But the PV cells themselves are zero maintenance. The only maintenance that may be required is on what we call the balancer systems, the part of the system that turns the DC from the PV into AC electricity. And it's very long-lived. Here's a picture of a happy Californian with some old PV cells. We really don't know how long they last, simply because they've not been out there in the field for long enough. But when I entered this industry a year ago, I was bowled over by the fact that the industry standard warranty for PV cells is 25 years. So that shows that there is a lot of confidence that all these PV manufacturers are happy to put the warranty provision on their balance sheet to cover a 25-year warranty. And therein possibly lies one of the challenges that I think is particularly acute with PV, but I think will affect other microgeneration technologies, is that because it's zero maintenance, by definition all the cost is up front. You have to lay the money out up front, and then you get free electricity for as long as the cells last. It could be 30, 40, 50 years. And therefore, to make successful PV at a large scale in terms of integrating it into the building, you need one of two things. You either need to have a very cleverly engineered financial program to go alongside the PV, and that's what we're doing here in Britain, or you need the governments to decide we would like to support and encourage PV and to put inside an incentive scheme to boot the whole system up. And my penultimate point is that PV is indeed very highly incentivized in other, by the word other I mean non-UK jurisdictions. And just to give you an idea, here's a very abbreviated table of something called a feed-in tariff. And I'd like to draw your attention to the one that says France BIPV. And what that line in the table means is that if you have a PV system, I'll explain BIPV in more detail in a moment, if you have a certain sort of PV system in France, the government will pay you 55 euro cents per kilowatt hour, guaranteed, underwritten by the government for 20 years as a result of doing so. And just to set that into context, the current price of electricity per kilowatt hour in France is 12 euro cents. So they're paying you almost 5 times the going rate for 20 years to encourage you to put PV in place. Our government is not on the list because it so far has chosen not to put a feed-in tariff in place. I said I explained BIPV. BIPV is a little acronym, a little piece of jargon, which stands for Building Integrated Photovoltaic. So just to give you a sense of that, most of the world's production of PV gets stuck in a rack in a field to create solar farms. So somewhere 92-93% of all PV in the world is used for solar farms. The remainder gets bolted onto buildings. And of that remainder, there's a tiny slice that actually gets properly integrated into the building. And but that is the slice that Solar Cemetery is in business to serve. But you can see by the feed-in tariffs in France that people like the French government are saying we want to incentivize the correct integration of solar into buildings and not just have the stuff put into fields or bolted onto roofs. So they're giving almost twice the incentive in order to do properly building integrated PV. Which I think very naturally leads on to my last point, which is that PV can, I would indeed say should, make a building beautiful. This is a bus station in London. This is some social housing in Croydon. This is a school in London. This is the Environment Agency headquarters. The solar there's a set of louvers that are used to shade the building, I think with a touch of architectural elegance. The louvers that are used to shade the building are actually PV generators generating electricity to supply the building. This is a bungalow in Norwich. And then finally, this is the Eden Centre down in Cornwall. So, to summarise, those are the 10 points that I made. I'd like to leave you with the thought that there is plenty of solar energy, even here in the UK, and that in the correct set of circumstances, and probably, almost certainly in combination with other energy-saving techniques and other renewable technologies, PV is part of the right solution. Thank you very much.